Welcome everybody to, gosh, is it the fifth session? I'll have to, I think this is our fifth meeting. And it is a long weekend, so I'm kind of anticipating that we'll be a smaller group, that folks will be having, time with their family, or, one last weekend at the cottage. But I did want to keep up with the momentum of reading. And I know some of you were able to join the meditation on Thursday. Again, many thanks to James Rowe for leading us in that. And I'm hoping we'll do it, once, maybe twice more before we're finished reading. I know it really filled my cup, as we say. So, as we've said, the last few weeks, the first couple of times we sort of wanted to demonstrate how we do book club, as it were. And I think everybody kind of understands now the rhythm of it. And so please, everyone is welcome to jump in and for sure interrupt, interject, ask questions, because, the conversation is very much the point of doing it this way. So Asher, good to see you too. I was just saying we're a long weekend in both Canada and the US, so I was anticipating that we'd probably be fewer tonight. We are picking up on page 48. And in fact, I might actually, I'm going to go back to page 47 and just pick up at the bottom of the page to refresh us in terms of where we were.
Kelly,
And
can I ask you a quick question? I
yes.
somehow in my computer land have lost my PDF. Where did you send it from your Sweet Rhubarb email
I
or
did
through
not.
Row?
That will have come from Rowe.
Okay, so I'm going to find it. Thank you.
Okay. And if you can't find it, I don't think I actually have a copy of the PDF. I've got the hard copy, so.
I'm sure I'll find it. Yeah, just
Okay.
I'm going to look right now.
Okay, great. Okay, so bottom of page 47 for the future listeners, as well as those gathered here, Baldwin's existential explanation for white supremacy. In Baldwin's work, the existential and the political are fundamentally intertwined. Human societies are shaped and reshaped in response to inescapable existential realities such as suffering, love, and death. Indeed, for Baldwin, the entire purpose of society is to create a bulwark against the inner and outer chaos, literally, in order to make life bearable and to keep the human race alive. He's calling it society. I think I hear the work of culture in that statement. How different cultures approach human experiences, such as love and death, has a profound effect on the resulting social order they produce. The political institutions of any nation, writes Baldwin, are always menaced and are ultimately controlled by the spiritual state of the nation. In Baldwin's experience, the displacement of white people's pain, existential and otherwise, onto Black Americans, the conjuring of compensatory myths of supremacy with intense material effects, was common from Birmingham to Los Angeles. Whether in American North or the South, or among the wealthy or poor, people betrayed a deluded attachment to whiteness, or, from his perspective, quote, assumed I would pay their dues for them, end quote. There are, of course, many white people who refused the delusion of supremacy. In The Devil Finds Work, Baldwin reminisces about his teacher, Orilla Bill Miller, who noticed his talent and brought him to plays and movies to stoke his creative potential. Bill Miller was not white for me in the way that the landlords and the storekeepers and the cops and most of my teachers were white. He continues, for Miss Miller, therefore, I began to suspect that white people did not act as they did because they were white, but for some other reason, and I began to try and locate and understand that reason. For those of you that just joined, we're halfway down page 48. In Baldwin's excavations of the white supremacy disaster zone, he continually returns to the force of existential fear in shaping compensatory attachments. White Americans do not believe in death, he argued in The Fire Next Time. Likewise, in The Evidence of Things Not Seen, Baldwin observes that, quote, whoever fears to die also must imagine that another can die in his place, end quote. For Baldwin, social constructions such as race and racism are mobilized as psychic buffers that help white people cope with their existential fears, albeit in immature and destructive ways. The fantasy of white racial superiority operates to soothe the primary vulnerability that many white North Americans feel in the face of mortality. For Baldwin, the ultimate hatred that white people needed to overcome was the hatred they felt for themselves as mortal and vulnerable beings. If white North Americans could overcome this self-hatred by genuinely affirming human finitude, then they would be much less likely to conjure fantasies of compensatory supremacy. White people in this country will have quite enough to do in learning how to accept and love themselves and each other, he writes. And when they have achieved this, which will not be tomorrow and may very well be never, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed. The stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death are difficult for all humans to navigate. In his essay, Nothing Personal, Baldwin observes that it is a fearful speculation, or rather a fearful knowledge, that one day one's eyes will no longer look out on the world. One can no longer be present at the universal morning roll call. For Baldwin, right America and the Euro-Christian world it emerged out of generally lacked the cultural resources to face and metabolize the fact of finitude, to see death less as a dominating master and more as an integral part of a fundamentally generous life course. This failure implanted belittlement and resentment at the psychic core of those who invented and rushed toward whiteness as a fantastical and destructive way to cope with their existential wounds. For even as it has profound, the Western delusion of color was created out of an unspeakable poverty. I feel like am I missing something there? I'm going to pause there just because I feel like that was a lot. Thoughts, comments? Agreed. I mean, we're the big topics of racism, white supremacy, along with the denial of, fear of death.
I have a question just from the middle of 48 to see if other people had, I just wanted to draw on the wisdom of the group. So, white Americans do not believe in death, he argued in The Fire Next Time. Likewise, in the evidence of things not seen, Baldwin observes that whoever fears to die also must imagine that another can die in his place. I'm having some trouble seeing how the latter follows from the former or is even another way of stating it, because I know that Baldwin was raised by a preacher, was a preacher, and that he uses a lot of the imagery and experience sort of central, or mythology central to Christianity, including the idea of somebody dying in our place, right? I'm not understanding the causal mechanism. Why is it that if we fear death, we have to imagine that our own death could be replaced by the death of someone else? It just doesn't quite follow to me, and I was wondering if other people understood this in a clear way they could explain to me.
I took it metaphorically, and I mean, perhaps he meant it literally, but in the sense that someone else can take on our burden, pay the price for us. And I think that that happens in, the way the appetite of North Americans, or I mean, particularly in Canada and the US, and our consumption habits, the disproportionate amount of resources that we use, and then people of other places pay the cost, both in terms of resource depletion and pollution. Climate change is happening, and although we're seeing it here now, the effects, it's been happening, and I think is far worse in other places. So I was assuming to some degree a metaphorical death.
And yeah, that would be a little easier for me to access, especially with all of the pieces of sort of the compensatory, sort of the oppression growing from the fear, the need to dominate another, specifically in this context, brown people by white people. But because the book is so centered on a literal experience of death and the fear of death, yeah, I was looking for a more literal experience, but okay.
I'm trying to think about it in that way, that in, again, our desire for more, including more life, what does that look like when we are aged and frail and still demanding more and have the power to do so?
Mhm.
I don't have a clear example, but like, how does that show up?
I mean, I sort of read it in part. There is this sort of Christian imagery of the ransom, but there's also, I just hear like bargaining, sort of the the nature of the mind trying desperately, sometimes frantically, sometimes irrationally, to find its way out of vulnerability and danger and death. And that, can't it be someone else, instead of me? It's almost like, the bargaining side of why me, which is sort of on the defeated end, and looking for somebody else to take my place in a world of chaos, right?
Mhm.
But no specific example that I can access it. It seems like it has to be embracing an irrationality and something logically impossible.
I think though there is something literal, if I mean, and last week I know it was said by a few of us that we feel like we need to be reading more Baldwin, but it has been literal in the sense of who gets sent to war, who's doing the backbreaking labor in the fields, and
Mm.
that does spare some from an early death. So yeah, thanks for asking that question, because I'm, now that I've, like for a minute or so it's been stewing, I'm like, I think it is literally true in some
Hmm.
instances.
Yeah, I like that example quite a bit. Still, I think it yeah, it doesn't deal with the root issue because it doesn't actually stave off death, but it staves off, like you said, an early death.
Hmm.
But I like that example. Yeah, who gets sent to the front lines? Who works in the fields?
Hmm.
Who's in the riskier jobs? Who's living in poverty? And why is it that 10 years earlier people in that zip code die rather than this zip code, right? Yeah.
Right, right, yeah. And the other thing I would say, although I agree, I mean, James Rowe is himself very literal in what he's talking about. I'm not sure that Baldwin holds the same, I think Baldwin's a little more poetic. So, and I do, again, we're talking about the existential fear of death, the denial of death, what the consequences are. But I'm so appreciating, to see death less as a dominating master and more as an integral part of a fundamentally generous life course. And that's maybe a bit of a mouthful, but James Rowe himself on Thursday spoke of, I'm going to paraphrase it, but just that death's incredible generosity towards life. And I'm still kind of marinating in that, what a beautiful image to have, that here is it's maybe not its purpose, but certainly a consequence. But the ability to feed the ones to come. And if we were able to imagine death in that way, instead of, something that, oh, woe is me. It's such a shift in the relationship. Anybody want to pick up? Well, I keep going.
As far as reading, you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to, if you... Yeah.
Sure, go ahead.
Are we at to Baldwin?
Yes.
To Baldwin, this poverty existed on multiple and braided planes, in long-standing class divisions that generate resentment, in the racist and colonial dispossession that was internal to Europe and still shapes the present for those whose ancestors experienced this violence, and in the existential immaturity of people lacking the cultural resources to face the facts of life. He believed these different planes of resentment played a key role in shaping compensatory attachments to white supremacy. While some resentments are more determinative in particular times and places, the existential plane always pushes on the present. Recall that for Baldwin, the political institutions of any nation are always menaced and ultimately controlled by the spiritual state of the nation. The same material and spiritual poverty that magnetized Euro-American attachments to supremacy was, according to Baldwin, a threat for all peoples. In Notes of a Native Son, he uses the case of his stepfather, who was the son of a slave, to meditate on how unmetabolized oppression can easily fuel lateral violence. Because his stepfather suffered from an quote, intolerable bitterness of spirit, and, quote, couldn't reach the white people he hated, he struck us. Likewise, in Baldwin's Harlem experience, encountering black cops was even more terrifying than crossing paths with white ones. Black cops subjected to dehumanization by their white peers and unable to effectively strike back displaced their anguish onto black people. Baldwin insisted that all peoples were susceptible to political and existential resentments and compensatory violence. Zeroing in on the ongoing force of existential resentment and channeling, Baldwin philosopher Cornel West recently observed that there is, quote, something inside of us that does have a propensity toward cruelty. Sometimes gratuitous cruelty in terms of how we deal with life, knowing that death is coming, and the insecurities of wanting to be superior. Black folk vis-a-vis black folk vis-a-vis brown folk. That's a human thing. Oof, I think I need to stop there, actually.
I'm thinking about, yeah, I mean, there's in these last couple of pages, there's a lot to unpack. And James Rowe isn't addressing it directly, but the idea that white people became white as a way of
Or in opposition to blackness.
yeah, and that it was a way of pitting poor people against poor people, essentially. And I know in this book it's a focus on contemplative practices as a way of attending to that, again, existential fear of death, which then to sort of to try and dismantle those systems of oppression. But I'm also thinking about it in terms of, we've got Baldwin talking about people lacking the cultural resources to face the facts of life, which the fact of life, I think he particularly means, is the fact that we will die, that life ends. And I'm thinking about recent conversations that culture's really a key piece. And so, yes, contemplative practices, but the idea that culture, if we're thinking about milk, culture digests the undigestible and, takes one thing and turns it into delicious cheese or yogurt. And, it gives us a way of consuming and being nourished by a thing. And similarly, I think this is both metaphorically and literally true, that culture helps us digest and integrate the reality that we will someday die. And because the dominant culture, white Western culture, is so impoverished, I think that's another place to maybe look at or to consider, that how do we retrieve how do we retrieve something that, I don't feel like I have a lived memory of it. And, we've become consumer culture, sort of the substitute, I guess. And I realize that there are still peoples that still have that, they have their songs, they have their traditions, and that is still available to some. But I am thinking of it from the broader society, I guess, and just wondering what people think about that. This is a heavy chapter.
Yeah, this was the first page or two I remember reading that just felt like it was punching me in the gut or the heart, but Baldwin often does that to me. I found the first part of the first full paragraph on 49. I got insecure, so I didn't stop reading, which is what I really wanted to do, and just sit with, because yeah, the braided planes of class division, colonial dispossession, and existential immaturity. I felt like we could have just talked about that for the next hour, and it would have been enough. It's just so much there. And even the phrase unspeakable poverty, knowing how he means it, it's just, yeah, it hits so deep. And the resentment held in the body of unmetabolized depression that can't go where it wants to go, can't be healed in the way it wants to be healed, and so it just goes at it whoever's the nearest being.
Uh, I was just going to point out the quote really struck me, that when it says the political institutions of any nation are always menaced and are ultimately controlled by the spiritual state of the nation. I'm like, well, that resonates. I was like, all right, I think we get that. That's scary stuff. Yet so timely for right now.
Mm-hmm. I feel too like I wouldn't have noticed that 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Different time.
Different time, but Baldwin is saying this back in the 60s. And so there's like, I'm making note of, again, the privilege of not knowing,
True.
that in not being affected directly by it, I would have very confidently told you 10 years ago that like, no, the rules, there's laws, there are mechanisms in place. You know, I would not have believed that what's happening was possible. And so, but to realize that ultimately we're controlled by the spiritual state of the nation, it's like, oof.
Kelly, I think Ashley was going to come in.
Yeah, please, Ashley.
It's kind of a related yet unrelated point that came to mind when I was reading this a number of days ago. So I'm just jumping back into it again. But from what I recall, what gave me pause, or one of the things that gave me pause, anyways, was the humanizing of experience across cultures and races when he brought in the way, Europeans have also been colonized. And I don't know if I'm touching back into the conversation perhaps that preceded this, but it really gave me a moment just to sit with our common humanity, and that all of us have suffered, and hold the spiritual, the somatic, the subconscious holdings of these events, whether we're consciously aware of them or otherwise, whether they're known facts or unknown cognitive facts. They're held by us. And there was something that was painfully beautiful in that.
Yeah, it's, again, the quote from Cornel West and the noticing of cruelty. And he says, wanting to be superior, Black folk vis-a-vis Black folk vis-a-vis brown folk, and that it's human. This is the becoming white that didn't exist 600 years ago. That people who had been colonized, persecuted, and embracing whiteness as a way of then reenacting that harm against others. So the lateral violence that we see within communities, but also the violence that's enacted when an oppressed group gains power and becomes the oppressor. So how do we interrupt that tendency? The quote, unspeakable poverty, I'm remembering that maybe some people have heard this before. I guess it's a saying in Spanish that somebody shared with me last week, and I don't have the Spanish of it, but that, to speak of someone and say, oh, they are so poor, all they have is money.
And again, that's so, speaking of politics and, our fearless leader here resonates.
Except that he's afraid of everything. But, yeah.
Yes, but he's so poor, all he has is money.
No,
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a hollow thing. Shall I pick up again, or do you want to sit with that a little more?
I think we can pick up.
For Baldwin, the possibility of violence and harm were woven into the human experience, and yet neither were inevitable. He communicates this tension and the resulting importance of folding existential transformation into political struggle in a classic formulation in Notes of a Native Son. It began to seem, quote, it began to seem that one would have to hold in the mind forever two ideas which seemed to be in opposition. The first idea was acceptance. The acceptance, totally without rancor, of life as it is, and men as they are. In the light of this idea, it goes without saying that injustice is a commonplace. But this did not mean that one could be complacent, for the second idea was of equal power, that one must never, in one's own life, accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight them with all one's strength. This fight begins, however, in the heart, and it now has been laid to my charge to keep my own heart free of hatred and despair. End quote. I'm going to say that line again. This fight begins, however, in the heart, and it now has been laid to my charge to keep my own heart free of hatred and despair. I feel like I want to put that on my fridge and see it every day. Existential acceptance, or facing the fact of death, is crucial to keeping one's heart free of despair and interrupting the compensatory will to supremacy. Throughout his writings, Baldwin returns to Black cultural forms, particularly blues and jazz music, which he thought provided resources for achieving a balance between existential acceptance and political resistance. In an essay on blues music, Baldwin describes the realities that the blues draw from: work, love, death, floods, lynchings. In fact, a series of disasters which can be summed up under the arbitrary heading, facts of life. It is telling that the political terror of lynching shares the same breath as primarily existential or natural concerns: death, floods, meeting subsistence needs. For Baldwin, white supremacy had overexposed Black people to the reality of finitude to the point where political violence was expected human terrain. But taking a dialectical outlook, Baldwin argued that elements of North American Black culture had managed to successfully transmute overexposure to mortality into an honest reckoning with the existential reality of finitude, a reckoning that whites had mostly avoided. The key for Baldwin was a willingness to face reality, no matter how brutal. I'm going to pause again there just because I know it's a pretty burdensome topic. And I'm thinking of, what I just said about 10 years ago. I wouldn't have thought that, the spiritual, what was the line? The spiritual state of the nation is driving things. And very similarly, this reckoning that we have mostly avoided as, whether as whites or as the dominant class. Yeah, and I'm thinking about the privilege of not knowing, but also the cost, again, the impoverishment. It's not without consequence, for both. I think Asher and I've had this conversation that, maybe there would be more appetite for anti-oppression work if white people understood how much white supremacy is costing them, us.
I likewise feel, though, that anti-oppression work is impoverished by its being hijacked by scientific materialism and its refusal to rest squarely in the truth that I think he keeps pointing to, which is that in the civil rights movement, anti-oppression work was framed and nonviolence work was framed as intrinsically spiritual by King, by X, and by James Baldwin and by Gandhi before them. Not saying that X fits into the nonviolent modality, but even he was raising this point, like, can we be spiritually in integrity if we're using the religion of the oppressor rather than something that he felt was truer to Blackness in the United States, or that could offer another way out? And they were all raising and circling around this question, but it was assumed that spirituality was central to it, right? And now I think there's a real poverty in anti-oppression work because there's a refusal to acknowledge that it asks fundamental and spiritual questions, and we're trying to keep it materialistic a lot of the time. And I even see a lot of memes that are going around right now around, like, well, nonviolence is tactical strategy, it's not spiritual or moral, and I think it's utter nonsense. I think you actually can't show up wholeheartedly for anti-oppression work, particularly nonviolent anti-oppression work, without wrestling with some very deep spiritual questions for yourself. And I think this whole book sort of points at that. You can't do this work around gratitude and, as Ashley brought in, beauty and to face one's own death without being with some pretty fundamental spiritual questions.
What do you think it looks like if that part is missing?
What do I think anti-oppression work looks like?
Yeah, if the spiritual is excluded from that work, what do you think the consequences are?
I mean, I'm in Portland. I'm seeing them. Like, I mean, there's a sweetness to relying on absurdity, and I'm glad that there's people are dressing up in frog outfits and doing their thing, and I think it's sweet and it's important to clown the sort of all too serious sort of white supremacy mechanisms. But what I also see is a real scatteredness and there's the scatteredness, and then there's the refusing to be uncomfortable. And I think that's really, you and I, Kelly, this has sort of been a central theme for us when we've spoken, is distress tolerance. And that I don't think you can actually do important anti-oppression work without a high level of distress tolerance. And I don't think you can actually develop distress tolerance without spiritual grounding. You have to believe that something is more important than your own comfort. And especially for a lot of white people in this movement, especially for a lot of older white people in this movement, I'll go until I'm uncomfortable to a certain degree, and then I need to go back home and rest on my couch. And I'm not demonizing rest, and I'm not demonizing joy. I'm not. But there has to be both, like rest and joy and play and culture building, and the willingness to give up some of the comfort that privilege has enshrined for us, and that capitalism has told us it is an injustice if we don't have, right?
Something that comes to mind for myself in connecting what you just brought forward, Asher, and this like poverty of spirit, or being impoverished just because of having the wealth, and that's it. And I think about societally what we're submerged in. We're submerged in this dopamine driven, pull your awareness outside of yourself and into this hyper artificial, mostly digital kind of environment that feeds the part of our brain, and that feeds the part of the brain that wants more of it, and causes the other part of the brain that can sit with the discomfort to languish, in a sense. And I also think about my own culture and Jamaican culture, and growing up listening to jazz and blues music and just hearing some pieces that would just break your heart. You don't even understand necessarily what the message is conveying as a child, but you can hear the pain that's in it. And to have that woven into a culture where there's comfort in sitting with that discomfort, I think about going to church in Jamaica and just the raw emotion that was allowed to be brought forth and shown and witnessed and held by a community. And when I look at some of the societal kind of elements of what I'm surrounded by here in Toronto, and that I don't feel it as much. There aren't as many spaces to step into that I'm familiar with, anyways, that allows for that. How much does that kind of perpetuate us continuing to be unwilling to turn compassionately towards that pain and sit with it? I feel like there was no real like crux to that point, but just a bunch of things that I wove together.
No, I hear it though, Ash, in the sense that that thing you describe, it's the do I want to say tool? Not quite tool, but it's the thing that allows us, like it leaves us resourced so that we can turn towards, you know, that this is, you know, I feel like in some ways this is the problem that we have, that we might feel appalled by what's happening. But what do we have to really work against it other than, you know, some clever memes and our indignation? There's, again, this idea of metabolizing, that we don't have the culture, you know, to digest these really hard things. And so yeah, I feel like you just gave us a beautiful example of what that can look like in
Yeah,
practice.
what you said that really jumped out and grabbed my heart was because it really took it to a much more, like what I was saying, to a much more practical place, which is like looking at what art and religion can do. And what they can do, among other things, is normalize pain and death. Not to, again, not to make us complacent or be like, oh, well, that's just the way it is, but to keep us in relationship with pain so that we don't think it's an injustice or that something's gone terribly wrong every time we're hurting, and that the blues was an entire musical institution dedicated to that, right? To taking pain and beauty and bringing them into conversation to remind people, like to resonate in the body and to remind them, like, yeah, actually, pain can be worked with skillfully and actually needs to be worked with skillfully in life to cultivate things like humility, compassion, patience, forgiveness. All of those things require being skillful in the face of pain, right?
And if I can just add one other thing, that we're doing it here.
Mm.
Us sitting with challenging text, concepts, things that tap into so many pain points within us, and giving space and pause for that is us doing it. So I thank you.
Aaron's offered a comment. Ashley, your recollection of what that music evoked is so wonderful. I'm in New Orleans after 2+ days with 200, doing our best to ponder many of these matters. And then she notes that, Asher, you said it. Yeah.
I'm just going to jump in and say I am so spent after 2 days of doing nothing but being immersed in all of this. Not so much, well, actually, a lot of the political stuff too, because there was a lot of oh, just so much. I am spent. Because I mean, there were something like 20 some speakers at this thing. presentations and keynotes. And then, of course, the networking. And people are just doing amazing work in the world. Today, I just got wrecked on schedule listening to a woman talk about the military and how they're being used now, and how to approach those who are dying, who have served in military capacity. And I got wrecked because I just wasn't prepared for the emergence of stuff that came up, because I am of the age where my classmates were drafted into the Vietnam conflict, and many died. And then, and many of us became what I see now, just so incredibly misguided in our assumptions of what was happening and what our fellow, our peers were doing, and what forces were moving things around, the pieces on the game board. Anyway, unfortunately, I'm here and I can't hear any of that beautiful music that this city is known for. I will not be doing that, but just to be here in this, knowing that, well, there's been a lot said about just walking on the pavers on the streets, and knowing what has walked there before, and how the city is a city of bones. And so I'm going to stay in, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm so moved by what the two ASH blah blah are saying, and I just look forward to hearing everyone's contributions. So peace back, as we say.
Thanks,
What's
Karen.
the conference you're at, Karen?
It's the National End of Life Doula Alliance, which is an organization that I've been involved with for a long time, for many, many conflicting reasons. I'm a proponent and a total shit stirrer of, it's like, this is the craziest movement. And I just have to, I can't keep my eyes out of it. And I can't, I mean, I am known in this group as being a cross-pollinating shit stirrer. Okay. and that I'm constantly pushing back at a lot of what's going on. But at the same time, I am in such awe of some of the people that are really doing amazing work. And I've where I'm sitting with it now is kind of the more the merrier, as long as we're walking towards, or looking towards, what it might be possible. I think that's a good thing. We need more people. We need something to hold the line against walking away from looking at death.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's happening. Whether people are looking at death in a way that is anything different from those institutions that have created the looking away, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like, what are we doing? Creating something that just looks like I mean, we've got nurses and doctors and social workers and all these licensed people quitting their jobs to become end-of-life doulas. And what do they want to do? They want to make it just like what they're running away from. It's like, what? But at the same time, there's a lot of community care work that is community building, village make. Oh man, I had to talk about village making today. So it is what it is, but I'm saturated. So but you know me, I still have too much energy to not say anything. So thank you. See you later. I may pop in again. I don't know. I'm listening.
Thanks, Karen. And I'm liking Ashleyer. Is this what we have? That works
Just
for
in
me.
case we needed a celebrity name.
Yeah. Yeah. Future hit the road as Ashleyer. I mean, I wish is it Doolapalooza? Is that what you guys call it? Or is that the other one? Yeah, it's Doolapalooza.
Yeah.
Just the name, geez.
Well, apparently there's, what is it? Lollapalooza?
Lollapalooza, yeah.
I know,
Yeah.
but I mean, it sort of seems
I know. Somebody
like,
thought it up.
it
Somebody
like
thought it up.
diminishes what it is. It's such an important work, and it's like,
Yeah.
It can be
Somebody,
playful.
yeah. I mean, there was some really good stuff presented. Really good stuff. There was some very clear areas where there needs to be a lot more conversation and contemplation of some of the things that were said. You know, it's just, again, it's like, why should it be any different from anything else? I mean, you know, there's people who just, they're coming into this with their own experiences and their own understandings. I mean, there were people that didn't know what, they literally didn't know what they were talking about. And that's okay. I mean, they weren't necessarily presenting, but, you know, it was like, it's okay. They were talking about it. And there were enough people there to hold, oh God, listen to me, hold space for it.
Oh, Karen.
It's, yeah.
Just wanted to, I wasn't looking ahead, but I just was seeing how it seems like Ashley was actually leading us to what comes soon after where we stopped, about blues and slave music in the United States. And just wanted to throw that out there and how much I would love to get to the music part.
Yeah. Let's do that. I just wanted to say quickly though, I mean, thank you, Karen. And you know, I'm so glad we're talking about this. I'm also, you know, the death care movement, the existential fear of death is there too. Scientific materialism is there too. So there's, you know, there's so much work to be done, and it's that piece, the work piece, the labor of it, that I just want to make note. Last week I was at a leadership retreat. It was really interesting to be a part of. It was in the US, and so people that are doing work in social justice and leaders in their own communities were invited together, and there were some serious chops. And one of the things that I noticed that was so interesting to me, and it wasn't super diverse, but it was somewhat diverse. But there were moments that things occasionally, there was a misstep, there was offense, things maybe got a little bit heated, and people would leave the room. But then they would come back. And that for me was like, oh, okay, this is what it looks like. You know, like take a minute, do what you need to do, and then you come back into it. And so that was a big takeaway for me, that, and I wanted to mention it relative to this book. This is some hard stuff we're in the midst of just reading, never mind living it. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk about it together.
Okay, now I do have to jump in again. There's one thing that this group has done consistently, whether it's been on Zoom or whether it's been in person, and that is to have a safe room, a place for people to be able to go and do some of that contemplative or some sort of ritual or whatever, which could be coloring a mandala or writing a letter, or we had a therapy dog here. Pepper. Pepper quieted me down. I mean, there were a couple of things that
Conchetta's dog?
no, I
Oh,
don't
okay.
know.
The
I don't know
blonde-
who.
Okay, never mind.
But anyway,
Yeah, I think I know Pepper. That's fine.
really, it's kind of a mid-sized,
Gray.
moving
She's
gray.
gray.
Yes,
Yeah, Pepper
yes,
and Conchetta.
Pepper.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yes, yes. They were here, and it was good.
Lovely.
But there were times, I mean, and I spoke with people who had been to other conferences. I made a new friend who was just at a conference that was talking about veterans and suicide. And she said, we spent 2 days and there was no safe space for anyone. We were talking about this heavy stuff and there was nowhere to go process this. And here I know, I mean, it is the nature of the people in these rooms this last couple of days, where you're going to be protected and offered a place of safety, because this stuff, I mean, as I said, I was totally, what do they say, gobsmacked by my own reaction to something that someone said today. Like, oh, didn't see that one coming. And I did kind of, when we had a lot of funeral directors here, actually, which was interesting because doula work is supposed to be more further upstream, but we're preparing people for, obviously, having to deal with licensed funeral directors or alternatives, but it's still mostly licensed funeral directors. And there were some things said that, you know, when it got into the sort of transactional area of, you know, why things cost what they do and what people offer and how it just got to, I mean, if you haven't figured out already in just the 3 times that I've been in this Zoom room, I kind of don't keep a straight face. So I wasn't necessarily even rolling my eyes. I was going, oh my God, you know, kind of things. And there were a couple of opportunities like that where it was like, I don't want that. I don't want to hear that. And yet, who am I to say what gets put out there in the world? I'm just glad I did hear it and then was able to process it and to ponder it. And there's a lot still for me that I'm going to take away from this that I need to work on. But I think one of the other troubling things is that there were people here who had never heard the word appropriation, that had no idea what decolonization meant. And yet, one thing I will say about what NITA is doing is that they are heavy into diversity, equity, inclusion, justice. And that was front and center the whole time.
I, for one,
Now I am going to be quiet.
I hope you keep calling out the funeral industrial complex, Karen. So when you said, I don't know, who am I to, I was like, well, I think it's actually extremely important to be an advocate and to let people know what their options are, and that the funeral industry has created a certain
Oh yeah, I mean,
that's not.
But it's not just them. I mean, you know how, I mean, it's like always, what had to happen for it to get to where it is now? And just keep going back incrementally to how the separation from what was different from what is now. And, you know, the pendulum is starting to swing back. there is pushback. I mean, I wasn't, felt like I was gut punched a couple of times with some of the things that were said. And I heard from other people that there were little ripples and things going on. I didn't hear other people talk about it, but I was really glad to hear that it's happening. And I think the wonderful thing about it at this point is that I think there's an open forum for feedback and saying, okay, so maybe the next step is to really look at have additional programming around this kind of stuff if this happens again, which I think it will. And in other webinars and stuff, take the topics that we can really look at it more closely.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's back to the not knowing, and I'm picturing the drops turn into a trickle, turns into a stream, turns into a raging river, and we're maybe still in the trickle stage, but God's willing, it will become more. I'll pick up again. For Baldwin, North American whites and the wider world had a tremendous amount to learn from blues music and its transmutation of excessive hardship. He wrote, quote, "The blues are rooted in the slave songs. The slaves discovered something genuinely terrible. Terrible because it sums up the universal challenge, the universal hope, the universal fear. The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off." End quote. Freedom and even joy is possible in the most constrained and dreadful circumstances. While Baldwin located the origins of Black music on the auction block, it likely had origins in indigenous African cosmologies. In Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition, Cedric Robinson argues that enslaved Africans drew from their ontological and cosmological systems to resist brutal conditions. Likewise, while acknowledging the diversity alive in every culture, Paget Henry argues that American Blacks inherited from Africa very ecstatic, life-affirming, and participatory attitudes towards spiritual existence. Perhaps a line can be drawn from the life-affirming ethos Henry identifies in African cosmologies to slave songs and early blues music, all the way up to the works of more contemporary Black artists. Nina Simone's "Ain't Got No, I Got Life" and Kendrick Lamar's "All Right" are impressive affirmations in the face of, quote, work, love, death, floods, lynchings. Simone, for example, counters the deprivations imposed by white supremacist culture with the liveliness coursing through her body. "What have I got nobody can take away?" she asks. "I got my arms, got my hands, got my fingers, got my legs, got my feet, got my toes, got my liver, got my blood. I've got life. I've got my freedom. I've got life." Simone turns to fleshly, carnal, and finite existence not as an oppressive burden, as it's often experienced in North America's death-denying and thus life-denying culture, but as a source of freedom. This life-affirming ethos, which Baldwin also drew from and developed, is central to what Cedric Robinson calls the Black radical tradition, the values, ideas, conceptions, and constructions of reality from which resistance was manufactured. In her book, All About Love, Bell Hooks shares a story about how well-known death researcher Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was deeply influenced by a Black hospital cleaning lady, calling her "my greatest teacher." As Hooks recounts, the secret that this wise Black woman knew, which Kubler-Ross positively appropriated, was that we must befriend death and let it be our guide in life, meeting it unafraid. When the Black cleaning lady, who had triumphed over many hardships in her own life, who had lost loved ones to early deaths, entered the rooms of the dying, she brought with her a willingness to talk openly about death without fear. End quote. The Black cleaning lady remains unnamed, and we don't know her history, but she appears to have carried with her the same life-affirming lessons Baldwin encountered in blues music, and that both he and Hooks valorize in their work. Further evidencing the centrality of a life-affirming ethos to the Black radical tradition, Audre Lorde warns about the dangerous illusion of immortality, which for her is not a solid base for either political activism or personal struggle. Likewise, in the Cancer Journals, Lorde advises that, quote, once we accept the actual existence of our dying, who can ever have power over us again? For Lorde, there is freedom, healing, and power in befriending the reality of death as part of the totality of life. I feel like that's another one of the paradoxes that, this thing that we avoid, both our dying and our death, that, we also then turn away from the many gifts that it brings, and, that it feeds life, that it might in fact be a peak experience. That's, many traditions teach that. And again, this idea that, like, how liberating, as Lorde says, who can ever have power over us again? The affirmative ethos shared by Hooks and Lorde, and that Baldwin saw in the blues, was, in his experience, largely missing in white America. We need to say yes to life, he writes. Until you can do that, you've not become a man or a woman. Now, in this country, this inability to say yes to life is part of our dilemma. To deny death is to deny life. For Baldwin, if you spend your entire life in flight from death, you are also in flight from life. Baldwin warns that being out of touch with the realities of life is dangerous, since you'll likely construct fantasies of supremacy to cope with the primary feelings of fear and smallness that propel the initial flight from death and thus life. There is an immaturity to this fantasizing, to this unwillingness to face reality. Although he deploys collective pronouns, Baldwin focuses on white America when he observes the failure on our part to accept the reality of pain, of anguish, of ambiguity, of death, has turned us into a very peculiar and monstrous people. Denying the reality of death only brings forth more death. I feel like that's a powerful statement. In On Being and Other Lies, in On Being White and Other Lies, Baldwin argues that by choosing to become white, many European immigrants paid a substantial cultural price. They disconnected from identities with more historical and cultural depth, such as Irish or Polish. We touched on that earlier. Because whiteness is a political relation rooted in the fantasy of supremacy, it lacks depth and realness, even as it has profound material effects. No community, writes Baldwin, can be established on so genocidal a lie. The earth-honoring traditions found in the deep histories of most European peoples prior to Christianization, within Gaelic cultural practices for those who originated from parts of contemporary Scotland, for example, likely included cultural forms capable of quelling existential resentment and promoting affirmation of life's totality, including death. Choosing the fantasy of whiteness was a choice against reality, against affirmation. For Baldwin, by deciding they were white, new Americans opted for safety instead of life. I feel like I want to come back to that with you, Asher. There is the safety of choosing fantasies of supremacy as compensation for histories of colonial belittlement, instead of facing and metabolizing the real pain those histories wrought. And then there is the existential safety of choosing supremacy as an immature salve in the face of finitude. A key implication of Baldwin's account of white supremacy is that an anti-racist praxis focused on white people must help them metabolize historical and existential pain so that compensatory bids for supremacy will be less likely and, quote, the Negro problem will no longer exist, for it will no longer be needed, end quote. The problem is most critical whiteness scholarship that engages with Baldwin overlooks his existential account of white supremacy. And then I'll pause there. Reflections, thoughts, comments? I do often think that we are really oblivious to the fact that over and over again, we're choosing safety or what we think is safety, like that there's this bargain that's struck that if we comply, if we support the systems of oppression, we ourselves will remain safe and secure. And of course, you know, it's a lie. It's a lie that creates our complicity. Well, it doesn't create it, you know, it's what leads to our complicity, to our passivity. But, you know, I think that's so much of what's happening now. Yeah, Deb says illusion of physical survival safety. Absolutely. And I think that's a little bit what's hard right now for many of us, is the witnessing of the fact that it was always a myth. That story of security is, you know, it's being revealed to be a falsehood.
Or maybe another layer of that would be, you know, because you gave a number of examples earlier that were true, like from a certain angle, right? There was insulation from certain kinds of harm or death by virtue of the oppressive system. But I think what he seems to be pointing to here a little more is what was the cost of that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and again, this sort of comes down to me to there's physical safety at the cost of spiritual safety or spiritual well-being, and what kind of life is it that you're keeping a hold of if you're trading the greater for the lesser there, especially if the lesser is something that is impermanent anyways, right? That, you know, you say you insulated yourself for another 5 or 10 years, great. And then what, you know? And then how are you going to look back at your life, or what is it going to mean to you? What's the point of living if you are spiritually impoverished and culturally impoverished, right?
Mm-hmm. I still, though, I agree with what you're saying, Asher. And I would still, though, say that the safety was an illusion. You know, it's a little bit like if I was to say, well, death doesn't exist because I'm not dead. You know, the safety was still an illusion in that just because you weren't experiencing the harm, it was still, I feel like I'm being a little inarticulate about this, but it was still always, it wasn't a true safety. It wasn't something that was rooted and that we were all like collectively, we weren't collectively tending safety and security. You know, it's a little bit like the idea that none of us are free until all of us are free. That, you know, collective liberation is necessary for actual liberation. It wasn't an illusion for a lot of people. The safety, Karen, you mean, I'm assuming? Or that a lot of people didn't experience the illusion of safety. Yes, absolutely. So.
Right, would we all agree that it's a white construct?
Totally.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, and I think that's where, again, Baldwin's calling white culture an immature, that I think a naivete is attributed to white culture.
but I think in
And
this context, yeah, sorry.
even, oh,
Oh, no, sorry. I was just seeing Josh put something in there. I don't remember if Baldwin comes up with this in the book, but I think it's relevant. He just put a link to an article.
thank you, Josh. Um,
I was just thinking, Kelly, that what you were saying, I mean, again, like what's the naivete or what's the illusoriness in your straddling, like, so there's the collective or the interconnected sort of perspective, and there's the individualism. And if we acknowledge that, well, the individualism is actually a reality within the naive or the immature system, then that illusion of safety actually feels pretty substantial, at least temporarily, right?
Totally.
If I'm only concerned about individual safety and not about collective safety, then look, like it worked for now.
Absolutely.
You
Yeah.
just have to not care about everybody else for, a long time.
Does anybody have any thoughts about when this latest version of illusion was birthed? I mean, was it after World War II? It seems to me that, in my life, I grew up thinking, oh, World War II solved it all. Now we really are the land of the brave and home of the free, land of the whatever it is. And that we were going to make everything good for everyone because we've on this massive scale, this global scale, addressed evil oppressors and won. And now we're going to create systems that protect that even more or celebrate it. I mean, that was the marketing. I just wonder how many versions of this illusion have there been over time. I don't know, it just came up thinking, okay, when did white people not feel safe? When did they invent the safety illusion?
Mm.
I mean, it almost seems like the question behind that is when, like, what was the seed of whiteness? Like, when did whiteness start? And I know that, like, Resmaa Menakem talks about the sort of Middle Ages and the trauma, the European displacement trauma. And then Kelly and I have both studied with, well, I think you have too, Karen, but, another teacher who talks about actually looking back to Rome, right? And, being Roman is like, okay, how much was early whiteness there, sort of displacing people from the land and their relationship with their own deities and language and making them all Roman, dispossessing people in that way. And like, what is there to hold to other than these very flimsy identities that give you a certain sense of safety vis-a-vis empire, right? Or colonization. And I don't know the answer, but I'm not sure even if that was what you were saying, but that's what I heard in it was if whiteness is synonymous or is the most recent version of this safety by disappearing my relationship with authentic culture and land, then it seems like there are echoes in generations upon generations of how far that goes back, what I have to trade in terms of integrity to belong enough to feel safe.
I'd add to that in the 20th century, the late 20th century, there started to be a narrative around the fact that history is over. And so it was very much believed that like we fixed everything.
Mhm.
Nothing's going to
Yeah.
happen now. And of course, it's been quite the reverse. And so I'm speculating. I don't know this to be true, but it feels like there might be something in it. But in biological terms, there's something called an extinction burst. And so right before a species ceases to be, there'll often be like a, like a lot of uh, offspring will be made, like there'll be this furious sort of attempt at reproduction, and that burst of activity happens just before the actual extinction event. And social scientists have adopted it into human behavior. And so, for example, like if you're trying to maybe correct a behavior in a child, that behavior might intensify right before a new habit is instilled. And I think about it in terms of late stage capitalism, that are we in the midst of an extinction burst, that, an old thing is dying and a new thing is maybe not being birthed, but maybe we're on the cusp of that beginning. And so are we, in terms of the intensity that seems to be marking these times? Yeah, there we go. Always darkest before the dawn, a poetic rendering of that idea. Which I know doesn't answer your question directly, Karen, but
No, I'm just I'm just thinking back. I'm not a scholar of this stuff. And so I'm thinking about from the culture that I grew up in, the fairly superficial attention paid to all this. And I'm going, how did I grow up in this illusion? Because I certainly did. It wasn't that I wasn't seeing other stuff, but it was quite convenient. Maybe it's the same thing about, well, if I'm not dead, I'm not going to die, you
Right.
know? And so it's like, I'm well protected as this nice little white girl that grew up on the west side of Madison in, educated neighborhood, pretty affluent. I didn't go without. What's wrong with the world? Oh, yeah. My dad just about killed me when I came home with a black boyfriend. Or, oh, yeah, when I did X, Y, or Z. Or, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But I've never really done any deep dive into a lot of the historical or sociological studying. I just went out and got stoned, so. But then I had to get sober. I did have to stay alive. So, it's so interesting putting it into a personal thing. Trying to take the big and bring it home, and then taking the home and making it big, and so I'm just looking at the illusion in my life right now.
I wanted to say
Yeah.
thank you, Kelly, for bringing in just the idea of the extinction burst. It's sort of trippy. I was just talking to a friend of mine about sort of the same dynamic in meditative context and then in like IFS work. But then also just actually thinking about seeing this at end of life, like with humans, that it's not uncommon to see somebody 24 to 48 hours before they die suddenly have a burst of clarity. They want
Rally.
a hamburger. They want to have a conversation when they've been nonverbal for a week.
Terminal
And
lucidity.
you said terminal lucidity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mom
We call
doesn't
it
have dementia anymore.
right. We call it rally. And it's like, they're gonna go back 2 decades now permanently.
Yeah.
Because they have a few hours of,
Yeah. Just thinking how many, like the macro and the micro, how that shows up. Yeah. Like a dying
good
star.
point.
Too.
I was
Yeah, good point.
I was thinking along the exact same lines, and you mentioned dying star. The word supernova came to mind.
Mhm.
What was I? Oh, I just completely lost my train of thought on that. The star just exploded. The
It
star
turned into a
just
black hole. It just collapsed.
it just collapsed on its own weight. Yeah, I'm going to have to stick a pin in that and circle back around to it.
Well, I will go ahead and stop the recording here. We're at a natural break just before the wages of whiteness. And I mean, there's only a few minutes left, but that was, I think we have a lot to digest. So I'll call it there. You know, be well, future listeners, and we'll see you all next Sunday, 6:30.
You.
So thanks, everybody. Oh, and I'm just stopping. There we go.